Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I never expected it, not in a million years. It was just an ordinary day when I found it. I'd been cleaning out an old drawer in our home, just throwing away junk, some forgotten bills and scraps. But there it was, tucked behind a stack of receipts. A letter. It was in an envelope with no return address, the handwriting unfamiliar. My heart raced as I opened it. The contents hit me like a punch. The letter said my husband's name wasn't really his name. His entire identity was fake. It was signed by someone I didn't know, but their words sent a chill down my spine. What was happening? Who was he? Really? My mind raced with questions, but the most terrifying part was that my husband didn't even know I had found it. What else had he been hiding from me all these years? Something wasn't right, and I was going to find out what. The shock of the letter left me paralyzed for a moment. My hands shook as I reread the words, trying to make sense of them. It couldn't be true, could it? My husband, my loving, caring husband, living under a fake name? But the letter didn't lie. There were no signs that this was a mistake. His real name, according to the letter, was something entirely different. I didn't recognize it, not even the smallest part. Panic surged through me. How could I have been so blind? We'd been together for years. How had I never noticed something like this? And if he wasn't who I thought he was, what else wasn't real? I had to know the truth. I spent the next few days in a daze, going over the letter again and again, trying to find any clue that might explain why he'd done this. But no answers came. I couldn't let it go. I had to find out who he was, and why he'd hidden this from me. What else was he hiding? I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was consumed with a single thought. Who was the man I'd married? And where was the real one? I needed more answers, so I started with his phone, the one thing that would surely hold the truth. It had always been by his side, glued to him like an extension of his arm. But now, holding it in my hands, it felt foreign. The password was different. He'd changed it. Panic clawed at me as I tried to guess, my fingers trembling as I typed in the usual combinations. No luck. I had to find another way. I dug through drawers, searched through old files, anything to find a way in. After hours of frustration, I found a clue, his old tablet. It was unlocked, sitting there, almost taunting me. I quickly synced it with the phone, praying it would give me access to his messages. When the screen flashed, I saw the reality. His social media accounts were gone, erased. Emails, texts, everything wiped clean. It wasn't just a new password. It was a complete erasure of his life. But why? What was he hiding? The more I saw, the more questions piled up. A sudden realization hit me. This wasn't just about a name change. He was running from something, someone, and I was in the middle of it. The secrets I was uncovering were far darker than I ever could have imagined. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. I needed to go deeper, to find a clue that would lead me to the truth. So, I started looking into every record, every document I could find. It wasn't until I stumbled across his birth certificate that I saw it, the name. A name I'd never heard before. It wasn't the one I'd known him by. There, in black and white, was his real identity. Or, at least, the one he'd used before we met. My heart stopped. Why had he never told me? How could he have hidden this from me for so long? I searched online, trying to find any traces of this name. Any leads that could explain why he'd abandoned it. What was worse, I found nothing. No social media profiles, no online presence, nothing. As if he didn't exist before the man I'd met. The deeper I looked, the more impossible it seemed to uncover his past. My frustration grew. Every answer I found led to even more questions. I was getting closer, but every step felt like it was leading me into a deeper, darker hole. As I scoured every detail of his life, I finally found a breakthrough. I stumbled upon a police record. It wasn't a recent one, but it was there, buried deep within some public records I was able to access. The name on the document matched the name from his birth certificate. But it wasn't just any police record. It listed charges of identity theft. My hands shook as I read the document, confirming what I'd feared. He wasn't just using a fake name. He had stolen someone else's identity. It wasn't just a slip-up or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. But the record didn't stop there. There were other names listed, too, aliases he'd used over the years. and one name kept reappearing, connected to multiple stolen identities. My mind raced as I tried to process everything. My husband wasn't just hiding who he was living on the run, changing his identity to escape something. The more I dug, the more dangerous it all seemed. I felt like I was uncovering a twisted puzzle, and I was terrified of what I might find next. The truth was darker than I could have ever imagined. The more I uncovered, the more I felt like I didn't know him at all. The man I thought I knew, the man I married, was an illusion. His past, his real past, was filled with lies, deceit, and secrets. It was clear now that I had been living with a stranger. Every memory I had of him, the late-night talks, the quiet dinners, the small moments of intimacy, felt tainted, as though they were built on a lie. I thought about everything he'd told me over the years. The stories, the justifications, the little details. It all made sense now in a way. The reason he always avoided certain topics, the way he'd shut down when I asked about his past. It was all to keep me in the dark. I was married to a man who had reinvented himself, a man who didn't want to be found. But why? What had he done that made him feel like he needed to erase himself? And what would happen if I exposed him? Could I live with the truth? Could I even survive it? I wasn't sure anymore. The only thing I knew for certain was that the man I loved was a shadow of someone else. And the man he had been was someone dangerous. The more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. I couldn't stop now. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. But the deeper I dug, the more I realized I was stepping into a world I didn't understand. I began to investigate the people connected to him, the ones from his past that he'd tried to erase. It led me to underground networks, dark corners of the city, and shady individuals. It was like a maze of deception, and every step I took seemed to lead me further into danger. I met a man who claimed to know my husband from before, but his eyes were filled with suspicion, as if he knew I was getting too close. "You don't want to know what you're looking for," he warned me, his voice low and urgent. I ignored his warning. I needed to know. As I pieced together the fragments of his life, I realized he had been living in a world of crime, surrounded by people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their secrets. I was no longer just an innocent wife. I had become part of something dark, something terrifying, and I had no choice but to continue, even as I feared what might come next. The more I delved into his past, the more I realized how deep his involvement went. He wasn't just a bystander, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, my husband had built connections with people who were deeply entrenched in criminal activities. I found records linking him to individuals I couldn't even pronounce the names of: mobsters, conmen, thieves, and worse. The trail led to meetings in hidden locations, transactions that smelled of illegal dealings, and whispers of things far worse than I could imagine. These people weren't just dangerous, they were ruthless. He had a network of criminals, each more terrifying than the last, all bound together by lies, betrayal, and blood. It dawned on me that my husband wasn't just running from the law. He was part of this underworld. I felt sick, betrayed not only by him but by my own ignorance. How had I been so blind? How had I missed the signs? I could no longer pretend that I didn't know the truth. And now that I did, I couldn't walk away from it. Not without knowing the full extent of his involvement and what that meant for me. I always thought he was a man of simple tastes, someone who didn't get mixed up in complicated situations. But the more I uncovered, the more I saw that everyone he'd ever called a friend was tied to something sinister. From the old contacts who'd popped up on his phone over the years to the so-called business associates he'd mentioned so casually, each one had their own dark past. Every one of them was connected to crimes, shady deals, or worse. It was like a web, each thread leading to another, pulling me deeper into the nightmare. I met a few of them, too. I couldn't avoid it anymore. One man, in particular, stood out, a friend from his past who now lived in the shadows of the criminal world. I confronted him once, hoping for some answers, but his cold, calculating smile told me everything I needed to know. "You're in too deep, lady," he told me. "You really don't want to know where this leads." I should have listened to him, but I couldn't stop now. Each interaction, each person, added another piece to the puzzle, and I was determined to put it all together. What had my husband really been involved in? And how far did it go? It became clear that everything I thought I knew about my husband was a lie. He had built a second life, one so carefully constructed that even I hadn't noticed the cracks. There were places he would go without explaining, people he would meet without any details. For years, he'd shielded me from it all. His lies wrapped up in a nice, neat package that I had willingly accepted. I began to realize just how much he'd manipulated me, how much control he'd exerted over our lives, shaping everything to fit the version of himself that he wanted me to believe in. I found a hidden apartment, one he had kept for himself, an entirely different place that no one knew about. It was furnished differently, a mirror image of the life we shared, but empty of the warmth we had. There, I found more evidence, papers, maps, and photos that I couldn't make sense of at first. But the deeper I looked, the clearer it became. He wasn't just hiding from me. He was hiding from something far darker. And that second life he'd been living? It was a cover, a decoy for what he was truly involved in. It was all a facade, and I had been a part of it without ever realizing it. The lies were one thing, but as I uncovered more, I realized that my husband wasn't just lying. He was hiding something far more dangerous. It wasn't just about stolen identities and fake names. He was involved in something that was beyond anything I could have imagined. The further I dug into his hidden life, the more it felt like I was uncovering a criminal empire. He wasn't just a small-time crook or a man with a few skeletons in his closet. No, he was connected to a vast, underground world that operated in the shadows, and he was at its center. My heart raced as I realized that I was standing on the edge of something enormous. He had betrayed me in ways I couldn't fully grasp, and I didn't know whether to run or confront him. The people I was uncovering, his so-called friends, were involved in acts of violence, corruption, and power. He had become one of them, and I couldn't escape the fear that they would come for me next. There was no going back. I had to choose between confronting him or leaving everything behind. Either way, it seemed like I was already too deep to walk away unscathed. As I pieced together the remnants of his past, I realized the true extent of his deception. He had erased himself. His real identity, everything about him before we met, had been obliterated, wiped clean from existence. I had always thought he was a man with a history, a past that shaped who he was. But it wasn't real. The life he'd built with me wasn't real. And worse, it wasn't just his name he'd stolen. He had assumed someone else's life entirely, fabricating a history, a personality, a reputation. I found the records, buried in deep corners of the internet, showing how he had methodically erased every trace of his former self. There were no parents, no childhood friends, no old photographs, nothing that would link him to the person he had been. It was as if he had never existed before the moment we met. His past was gone, and what I saw in front of me was an empty shell. A man without a past, and with that, a man who could be anyone. That's when I realized. He was not just hiding from the law, from criminals, from his old life. He was running from himself. His identity was a carefully crafted lie, and now I was left to figure out who he really was and what he'd done to make sure no one would ever know. After everything I had uncovered, there was no avoiding it any longer. I had to confront him. I waited until he came home, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I was terrified of what I might hear, but I knew there was no turning back. When he walked through the door, I barely recognized him. The man who had once been my husband, my partner, was now a stranger. He could sense the change in me, the shift in the air, and I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But he said nothing at first, just stood there, waiting for me to speak. I threw everything at him. The names, the lies, the stolen identity. I told him about the records, the people, the criminal connections, and I watched as his face drained of color. But instead of confessing, instead of explaining, he only grew defensive. "You don't understand," he said, his voice cold. "It was never meant to be this way." The words stung, but I pressed him further. "Who are you? Really?" His eyes avoided mine, and for the first time, I saw the fear in him. The man I had married wasn't just a liar. He was a coward. He'd spent so long running from his past that he couldn't even face me anymore. The man in front of me wasn't the person I had known. He was someone broken, someone lost, And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I even wanted to know who he was anymore. He didn't say much after that. The silence between us was suffocating, filled with a tension I couldn't cut through. He didn't deny the allegations. Instead, he simply stood there, avoiding my gaze, as though waiting for me to leave, waiting for me to walk away from the truth. But I couldn't. I couldn't walk away from this, not after everything I had uncovered. I kept pressing, but his responses were empty, hollow. He was hiding something deeper, something more terrifying than I had imagined. His reluctance to speak, his refusal to open up, spoke louder than anything he could say. It was like he was scared, not of me, but of something much bigger than the lies. Something darker. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was terrified of the truth coming out. And that fear, that paralyzing terror, told me there was something worse lurking in his past than even the stolen identities and criminal connections. I knew he was hiding it from me, but now I had to find out what that something was. What was it that he feared so much? What could be so bad that even the man I thought I loved couldn't face it? Just when I thought I had reached the limit of my discoveries, something else came to light. A phone call that would change everything. It was late at night when I received it, an unknown number flashing on my screen. Hesitant, I answered, my stomach twisting in knots. "Is this Mrs. Walker?" a voice on the other end asked. I froze. My heart stopped. "Who is this?" I demanded. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. "I know what your husband has been hiding," the voice continued, calm and steady. "And if you want to know the truth, you'll meet me." My mind raced. Who was this? How did they know about me? And more importantly, how did they know about him? "Where do I meet you?" I asked before I could stop myself. The voice gave me an address, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, and then hung up. I sat there in stunned silence, every part of me screaming to ignore it, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. The truth was out there, and now I had no choice but to follow it. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew I couldn't let him, my husband, this man I thought I knew win. I had to know everything. And now, someone else was pulling the strings, someone who knew far more than I did. The address led me to an old, run-down warehouse, the kind of place that looked abandoned by everyone except the shadows. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I approached, every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn around. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. I stepped inside cautiously, the creaking of the wooden floorboards echoing in the silence. The place was cold, empty, with nothing but dust and broken crates scattered around. I didn't see anyone. I felt like a fool, waiting in the dark, my breath shallow, eyes darting around. Then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. Only a shadow. I tried to stay calm, but panic was slowly creeping in. And that's when I saw it, a small table in the corner, with files stacked on top. I moved toward it slowly, my hands trembling. As I flipped through the files, I saw his name again. My husband's real name, linked to a series of documents I could barely comprehend. But one thing was clear. He wasn't the only one involved. There were others. Other names, other faces, all connected to a criminal network far larger than I could imagine. And someone had brought me here to reveal it. But who? The realization hit me. I wasn't alone in this. There were people watching, people waiting for me to uncover the truth. Just as I started to process the files, a man stepped out from the shadows. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket that made him blend into the surroundings. His face was obscured, but I recognized his voice immediately. "You came." His words were calm, but there was a cold edge to them. "You want the truth, don't you?" My heart pounded in my chest as I nodded, barely able to breathe. "You think you know everything, but you have no idea who your husband really is." I tried to steady myself, but the flood of emotions overwhelmed me. "Who are you?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smirked, then stepped closer, just enough for the dim light to reveal his face. It was someone I didn't recognize. "I'm someone who knows your husband better than you ever will," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of contempt and pity. He pulled a picture from his jacket pocket and tossed it on the table. I froze when I saw it. It was a photo of my husband, but he was standing with a group of men, all armed and surrounded by piles of money. The truth hit me like a slap in the face. My husband wasn't just involved in a criminal network. He was at its center. He was a key player in something far bigger and more dangerous than I could have imagined. The man's words echoed in my mind. You think you know him, but you don't. He's been lying to you for years. The man's warning stuck with me long after I left the warehouse. The deeper you go, he had said, the more you risk. There's no turning back. But I had already gone too far to stop now. The truth was out there, and I couldn't just walk away from it. My heart raced as I thought about everything I had uncovered. The lies, the stolen identities, the criminal empire. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the danger wasn't just from the criminals my husband was connected to. The real danger was that I had become a part of this mess. I was in too deep, and there was no way to get out without facing the consequences. I couldn't escape the people my husband had brought into my life, and I couldn't unsee the things I had discovered. What did all of this mean for me? What had I become? I had no answers, just more questions, and the more I searched for them, the more I realized how much danger I was in. There was no going back. The web my husband had woven was far too intricate, and I was now trapped in the center of it. The silence between us grew unbearable. After the warehouse, I thought he would come to me, to explain, to try and salvage whatever was left of our marriage. But he didn't. I called him over and over, leaving messages that went unanswered. The once familiar warmth in his voice was replaced by cold indifference. It was as if he had vanished, disappearing into thin air, and leaving me alone with the terrifying truth. I knew he was avoiding me, and it only confirmed what I feared most. I was no longer part of his life. I had crossed a line, and now, he wasn't just hiding his past. He was running from me, from everything I knew about him. It was like he had planned it all along, knowing that if I ever found out, he would have to disappear. But where could he go? Who could protect him from the web of lies and danger he had tangled himself in? I needed to know where he was, but I didn't know where to look anymore. I was losing him. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I was more terrified of losing him or of what would happen when I finally caught up to him. The more I searched, the more I realized that my husband had covered every angle. But there was one place I hadn't looked yet: his finances. I had never suspected that money would be the key to everything. But when I gained access to one of his secret accounts, I was horrified by what I found. It wasn't just the sheer amount of money that shocked me. It was the transactions, the hidden connections, the names that popped up repeatedly, people I had never heard of, places I didn't recognize. He had been funneling money to accounts in offshore banks, all while using different aliases. I couldn't understand all of it at first, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. His entire life, his whole existence, was built on deception and manipulation. Every penny he had earned, every connection he had made, was part of something bigger than I could comprehend. And buried deep within these files were even darker secrets, things that could destroy everything. He wasn't just involved in criminal activities. He was a key player in an international network that spanned continents, and all of it had been hidden right under my nose. I realized that I wasn't just married to a man with a past. I had married a man who had built an entire empire of lies. Just when I thought I was getting closer to the truth, the threat started. The first came in the form of a message. It was brief, but its meaning was clear. Stop digging. You're going to regret it. My pulse quickened as I stared at the text, my mind racing. Who was it from? I had no idea, but it felt like a warning, a message from someone who knew what I was doing, someone who was watching my every move. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted, that the more I uncovered, the more dangerous it became. The people involved in this weren't just criminals. They were powerful, and they didn't care about the lives of people like me. I tried to ignore the fear creeping up my spine, but it was impossible. The threats kept coming, each one more direct than the last. Someone knew I was close, and they were going to stop me before I could expose the truth. My heart raced as I realized just how dangerous this situation had become. I was no longer just a wife searching for answers. I was a target, and the more I uncovered, the more perilous it became. I couldn't turn back. I was in this too deep, and now, I had no choice but to see it through. no matter the cost. The panic inside me was suffocating. After receiving the cryptic warnings, I decided I couldn't handle this alone anymore. I had to go to the authorities to get help before things spiraled even further. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, they could offer some protection or answers. But when I went to the police, I was met with skepticism. I sat across from an officer, explaining everything I had uncovered. The fake names, the stolen identities, the criminal connections, the money trails, the threats. His face remained impassive, and when I finished, he shook his head. "This sounds like you're getting carried away," he said dismissively. "Are you sure you're not overreacting?" Overreacting? I felt like I was living in a nightmare. But he didn't seem to understand. He didn't believe me. Without solid proof, he continued, "There's nothing we can do. Maybe you should take a step back and think this through." I left the station in a daze, my mind reeling. I couldn't believe it. The police didn't think I was in danger. They thought I was just some hysterical wife making wild accusations. But deep down, I knew I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't overreacting. I was uncovering a web of lies and criminal activity that no one was ready to confront. I couldn't give up. The police wouldn't help me, but I wasn't going to let this go. I had come so far, and I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered everything. And then, just when I thought I had hit a dead end, I found something that changed everything. Hidden inside a drawer in the back of his office, I discovered a small, locked box. At first, it seemed insignificant, just a simple metal box, but I knew it was important. It took everything in me to unlock it. When I finally did, my heart stopped. Inside, there were documents that I hadn't seen before, files with names, dates, and pictures, along with detailed information on a series of transactions that shocked me. But the most disturbing part? One of the names in those files was mine. There, in black and white, was my name, connected to a group of people I had never heard of. And alongside it were notes about surveillance, tracking my every move. I was being watched. All this time, I had thought I was searching for the truth, but in reality, I was the one being investigated. It was like my whole life had been a pawn in someone else's game. And the worst part? My husband was involved in all of it. He had been using me. I had been unknowingly part of something much bigger, much darker than I could ever have imagined. Just when I thought I couldn't be more terrified, someone from my past reached out to me. It was a name I hadn't heard in years, one that I had almost forgotten. It was Claire, an old acquaintance from my college days, someone I had lost touch with after graduation. Her message was short, but it sent a chill down my spine. "I know what's happening. I know who your husband really is. And I think you need to listen to me." I had no idea what she was talking about, but the fear in her message made me hesitate. How did she know about my husband? Why was she contacting me now? I reached out to her, desperate for answers, and when she called me back, I could hear the urgency in her voice. "This is bigger than you realize," she said. "I know everything about your husband. I know who he really works for, and I know what he's capable of." My heart raced. I couldn't process what she was saying. She was telling me things that didn't make sense, things that threatened to unravel everything I thought I knew. And yet, something in her voice told me that she was telling the truth. "I can help you," she added, "but we need to do this my way. There's too much at risk. You're in way over your head." Her words were like a warning, and I wasn't sure whether I could trust her. But she knew things no one else did. And somehow, I knew she was my only chance to survive the web my husband had entangled me in. Claire's voice echoed in my mind long after the phone call ended. She was right about one thing. I was in way over my head. I had been so focused on uncovering the truth about my husband that I hadn't stopped to consider the depth of the danger I was in. Every step I had taken had led me deeper into a world I didn't belong in, one filled with criminals, deception, and corruption. But what terrified me more than anything was Claire's warning. "They're watching you. They know you're digging. And if you don't stop now, it will be too late." I had ignored the danger signs for too long, thinking that if I just uncovered one more secret, I'd be able to escape this nightmare. But I was wrong. I was already trapped, and the more I learned, the more I realized that I couldn't just walk away. Claire was right. There was no turning back now. The people involved in this weren't just dangerous, they were ruthless. And the closer I got to the truth, the more perilous it became. I was in the eye of the storm, and there was no way out unless I could find a way to outsmart them. I couldn't ignore Claire's warnings, but I also couldn't let her have all the answers. I needed to see her, to hear her side of the story in person. So, I arranged a meeting. The location she gave me was a small cafe on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, my nerves were on edge. I hadn't felt this tense in a long time. Was this a trap? Was I walking right into their hands? But when I stepped inside, there was no sign of danger, no one lurking in the shadows. The cafe was quiet, the usual hum of conversation replaced by the soft clink of coffee cups. I sat down at a table by the window, waiting for Claire to show up. But when she did, it wasn't what I expected. Claire walked in, her face pale, her eyes filled with fear. She wasn't the confident, self-assured woman I remembered. She looked like someone running from something, someone who had seen too much. She sat down across from me without a word, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. But then, her voice broke the silence. "We don't have much time," she whispered. "They know you're coming. They've been tracking you. And if you don't leave now, it's over." I froze. She was right. Something was off. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Not yet. I had to know what she knew, no matter how dangerous it was. Just as Claire spoke the words I feared the most, my phone buzzed. I looked down, and my heart stopped. It was him, my husband, the man who had lied to me, used me, and now he was calling me. I had no idea what to expect, but the tone of the call was different this time. He wasn't angry or defensive. He wasn't pleading. Instead, there was an eerie calmness in his voice. "I know you've been looking for answers," he said, his voice like ice. "And I know you've found some of them. But I need you to stop right now." His words were chilling. He wasn't asking, he was commanding. And for the first time, I realized the depth of the betrayal. All this time, I had been trying to uncover the truth about him, but in reality, I had never even known who he truly was. The man I thought I married. His entire life was a lie. He wasn't just hiding a past. He was hiding a future filled with dangerous people, with plans that involved me in ways I couldn't comprehend. "You think you can expose me?" he continued, his voice low and cold. "But you don't know who you're dealing with. You never did." The truth hit me hard. He wasn't just protecting himself, he was threatening me. And it was then that I understood. This was never just about his past. This was about my future. And if I didn't stop digging, I wouldn't have one. His words rang in my ears, chilling me to the core. "You don't know who you're dealing with." He wasn't just threatening me. He was making it clear that I was out of my depth. And in that moment, I realized how much danger I was truly in. I couldn't keep pushing forward without facing the consequences. But I couldn't stop either. I needed answers. I needed to know everything. I met Claire again, and this time, the urgency in her voice was palpable. "You don't understand. They've been monitoring you. You're already too close to everything. We need to get you out of here now." She was shaking, her eyes darting nervously around the room. For the first time, I saw the fear in her. She wasn't just helping me. She was trying to save me. But I didn't know if I could trust her anymore. The web was becoming too complicated, too tangled. I could feel the walls closing in on me. I tried to push past the doubt, but the more I learned, the more I realized that I wasn't just uncovering secrets. I was exposing myself to a force far stronger than I could ever imagine. But before I could make any decision, I heard it. A car screeching to a halt outside. I turned my head, and that's when I saw them. Men in dark suits, moving fast. I had to act. I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I bolted from the cafe, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know where to go, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The men in dark suits were closing in on me, their movements coordinated and precise. It felt like the entire city was closing in on me, as if they knew exactly where I was going, what I was thinking. Every turn I made, every alley I darted down, I could feel them getting closer. My mind raced. How had they found me? Had they been tracking me all along? Or had my husband tipped them off? But as I ran, I started to realize something. This wasn't just about my husband anymore. This was about something much bigger. These men were professionals. They weren't just after me because of my husband. They were after me because I knew too much. I had become a threat, and now I was being hunted. I couldn't think clearly, the adrenaline blurring my thoughts. I had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they wouldn't look. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were already ahead of me, anticipating my every move. And that's when it hit me. I was no longer in control. I had been pulled into a world I couldn't escape, a world where I was just a pawn in a game I didn't understand. And now, the chase was on. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I had nowhere to hide. They were too fast, too coordinated. No matter where I went, they were always one step ahead, shadowing me, waiting for me to slip up. And eventually, I did. I ran down a dead-end street, only to be met by the cold metal of a gun pressed against my back. "It's over," one of the men said in a low, gravelly voice. "You should have stopped when you had the chance." I froze, my heart racing. I could hear my own breath, shallow and panicked. But there was no escape, no bargaining, no pleading. I was cornered. The man's grip tightened on the gun, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the worst. But instead of pulling the trigger, he stepped back, signaling to the others to let me go. "Not yet," he said cryptically. "The boss wants to speak with you." My blood ran cold as they forced me into a car. I didn't know who the boss was, but I could already feel the weight of the danger closing in. This wasn't about money. This wasn't about my husband anymore. This was about something far worse. They had a plan for me, and I was expendable. Just another pawn in a game that I didn't understand. They drove for what felt like hours, the cityscape fading away as we ventured deeper into unknown territory. My mind raced with every bump of the road, trying to come up with a plan, trying to figure out what was happening. Where were they taking me? What did they want from me? I was trapped in the back of a black van, the interior as cold as my thoughts. The men who had captured me didn't speak, their faces hidden in the shadows. Every time I tried to look at them, their eyes seemed to pierce me with an icy coldness, as if they were daring me to try something foolish. There was no way out. Eventually, the vehicle came to a stop, and the doors swung open. I was pulled out and escorted through a narrow, dimly lit hallway. The air was thick, musty, and smelled of old wood. It didn't take long to realize I was in some kind of underground facility, a place designed for secrecy. No windows, no exits, no escape. I was pushed into a small, sterile room, and the door slammed shut behind me. I tried to speak, to demand answers, but the words caught in my throat. The reality of the situation was sinking in. I was completely alone, and no one knew where I was. I had no choice but to wait, but my heart told me that whatever came next would be far worse than anything I had faced so far. I was alone in the cold room for hours. My mind spun with questions, each one more frantic than the last. But then, the door opened. A tall figure stood in the doorway, the silhouette of a man whose presence sent a wave of unease through my entire body. He didn't have to say a word. His cold, calculating stare told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't just a man. He was a leader, a mastermind, and I was in his grip now. "So," he said, his voice low and smooth, "you've been digging into things you shouldn't have." His tone wasn't angry. It wasn't even threatening. It was just matter of fact, as if he already knew everything about me, everything I had uncovered. "You thought you could expose my operation, didn't you?" he continued, pacing slowly in front of me. "You thought your husband was your only problem. But the truth is, your husband was just a small part of a much larger game. And you, my dear, have just become a very important piece." My heart sank. I had underestimated everything. This man, this boss, was the one pulling the strings. He controlled everything, and I had stumbled into the middle of it. "You think you've been betrayed, but the truth is," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you've been a part of this from the very beginning. Your husband? He was just the first step. You were always meant to play a role." The floor beneath me seemed to disappear. My knees buckled as the weight of his words crashed down on me. Everything I had known, everything I had believed, was nothing more than a lie. The boss's words felt like a punch to the gut. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. "Your husband," the boss continued, "wasn't just a small-time thief. He was working for the highest bidder, pulling strings in a network that spans continents. My mind whirled, trying to process what he was saying. Your husband was the key to getting you here, the boss said, his voice growing colder. He lured you in, built this false life, and you were the perfect pawn. You still don't understand, do you? I was silent, unable to speak, my brain struggling to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before me. Everything he did, the boss went on, was for one purpose: to get you involved, to make you trust him. And now, you're in too deep. There's no way out. You're a part of this now, whether you want to be or not. The realization hit me hard. All this time, I thought I was uncovering the truth, but I had been a part of the plan all along. My husband had been manipulating me from the very start. He had played me, and I had walked right into it. I had no idea who I could trust anymore. My entire world had been turned upside down, and now I was trapped in the hands of the very people my husband had been working for. They controlled everything. My life, my choices, my future. It was all in their hands now. The boss leaned closer, his eyes cold and calculating. You have two options, he said, his voice measured and deliberate. You can cooperate, do exactly what we tell you, and we'll let you walk away. Or you can refuse, and everything you love, everyone you care about, will be gone. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. I was trapped. There was no way out unless I complied. I had been pushed into a corner, and every option seemed worse than the last. What do you want from me? I finally managed to choke out, my voice trembling. Simple, the boss replied with a smirk. We need you to keep digging. We need you to keep looking for the truth. But this time, you'll do it on our terms. You'll report back to us. You'll stay in the dark, and we'll pull the strings. You will be our inside source, and you will never stop. Because if you do, we'll come for you. And we'll come for everyone you care about. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the reality of my situation sank in. I had no power here, no leverage. If I didn't play their game, I would lose everything. And I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Understand? He asked, his eyes piercing through me. I nodded, my stomach in knots. I didn't have a choice. But as I walked away from that room, the weight of the ultimatum pressing on my chest, one thought echoed in my mind. This was just the beginning. Days turned into weeks, and I did exactly what they told me. I dug into my husband's past, into every dark corner of his life that I hadn't known about. I uncovered things, horrible things, that made my skin crawl. But with every step I took, the truth became clearer. I wasn't just being forced to dig into my husband's past. I was being used to expose a larger, far more dangerous network. The deeper I went, the more I realized I was becoming part of it. But still, there was a part of me that resisted. I couldn't just let them control me. I couldn't let them win. Something inside me refused to give up. I knew there had to be a way out, a way to stop this madness. I started looking for any cracks in their carefully constructed facade, anything I could use to my advantage. I wasn't sure how, but I knew I had to find a way to turn the tables. They had taken everything from me, my peace, my trust, my safety. But I wasn't going to let them take my freedom, not without a fight. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. While I worked under their watchful eyes, someone else had been watching me. Someone who knew the network better than anyone. A former member of the organization who had escaped its clutches years ago. I didn't know who they were at first, only that they reached out to me, in whispers, with information too valuable to ignore. I was cautious at first. Trusting anyone in this situation was dangerous. But the messages kept coming. They told me things no one else could have known. Details about the operations, the key players, the secret plans they had for me. They knew about the boss, about the network's reach. And they knew how to break it. The more I learned, the more I understood. This person wasn't just an ally, they were a lifeline. They gave me the courage to fight back. But the more I trusted them, the more I realized how deep their knowledge ran. Could they be trusted? Or was I walking into another trap? It didn't matter. The truth was that I had no choice. If I wanted to survive, I needed to risk everything. And this mysterious ally was the only chance I had left. The messages kept coming, each one more urgent than the last. My mysterious ally had a plan, a dangerous, complicated plan that could end everything. But there was a catch. It was risky. One mistake, one wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. The boss would know, and I'd never get another chance to escape. But the more I heard from my ally, the more I realized there was no turning back. The network was too vast, too powerful. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into their control. The plan involved exposing the network, creating a breach that would unravel everything they'd built. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot I had. I had to trust this person, trust that they knew what they were doing, even though I didn't know them, even though I didn't know if I could trust anyone anymore. We need to hit them where it hurts, the messages said. Their money, their reputation, their control over people like you. If we can break their foundation, we can bring them down. But it's all or nothing. I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me. If I failed, I knew what would happen. But if I succeeded, if I could expose them all, then maybe, just maybe, I could be free. But I was no fool. I knew the stakes. This was my last chance. As I followed the trail my ally had given me, I couldn't shake the feeling that my entire life had been a lie. My husband, he wasn't just a small-time criminal. He was one of the key players in a criminal empire that spanned continents. The more I uncovered, the darker and more twisted his involvement became. He wasn't just hiding his past from me. He had been hiding his true identity, his role in an underground network that controlled everything from illegal arms deals to human trafficking. But what disturbed me more than anything was the realization that he had chosen me. I wasn't just some random victim in this. I had been selected, groomed even, to be a part of this web of lies. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. He had used me to further his own agenda, to keep me close enough so I wouldn't discover the truth. And all this time, I thought I was in control of my life. I thought I had chosen him, but in reality, he had always been the one pulling the strings. I had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. And now, the truth was out. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how deep his involvement went. This wasn't just about money or power, it was about control. He had been controlling my life from the very start. The final part of the plan was set in motion. My ally had given me the coordinates, the instructions. Everything was mapped out. I was ready to make my move. The plan was simple: break into one of the organization's key locations, retrieve the files, and expose the network to the authorities. It sounded easy enough, but I knew it wouldn't be. There were too many risks, too many ways it could go wrong. But this was it. If I succeeded, everything would change. But even as I prepared to carry out the plan, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Who was I really working with? This mysterious ally, this person who had all the answers. Who were they really? Were they just another piece of the puzzle? Another player in a game that I couldn't even comprehend? I was so deep into this web now, I didn't know who I could trust. The further I went, the more I realized how little I knew about the true scope of this operation. Who was pulling the strings? Who was controlling my every move? Was I about to make the biggest mistake of my life by trusting someone who might be just as dangerous as the people I was trying to escape? I had no answers. All I had was the mission. The clock was ticking, and I had to act. But something in my gut told me this was only the beginning of a much darker journey. I was walking a tightrope now. Every step I took brought me closer to the truth, but it also brought me closer to the edge. The deeper I dug into the network, the more dangerous it became. The stakes were higher than ever. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the location where everything would go down. The plan was simple in theory: break in, retrieve the documents, expose the network. But nothing about this was simple. Not anymore. As I crept through the shadows, I felt the weight of the mission pressing down on me. Every move I made seemed to echo in the silence. And then, as if on cue, I heard the sound of footsteps, too many, too close. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed myself against the wall, praying they wouldn't find me. But I knew they would. The whole operation had been a trap from the start. I had been set up. I wasn't just a pawn anymore. I was the target. The walls were closing in, and I realized with cold clarity that I might never get out of this alive. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. The footsteps were getting closer, the sound of boots on the concrete floor sending chills down my spine. I had been so careful, so meticulous, but it was all for nothing. They knew I was coming. They had been waiting for me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I had walked right into their trap. I didn't have a choice. I had to make a decision. Stay hidden and risk being found later, or confront them now and fight for my life. My heart raced as I made my move. I ducked into a nearby office, slamming the door behind me, trying to lock it as quietly as possible. My fingers trembled as I searched for something, anything, that could help me. I had no weapons, no tools, no way to defend myself, but I wasn't going down without a fight. I had come too far, learned too much, to let them take me without a struggle. The door handle rattled, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they broke in. My pulse was deafening in my ears. They had me cornered. And yet, somehow, I still felt that spark of defiance. I couldn't go down without a fight. I had to survive. I had to finish what I started. As the door to the office rattled, I realized I had reached a breaking point. The only way out was through. I had to make a choice that could either end my nightmare or seal my fate forever. The room was filled with the sound of approaching footsteps, the weight of the decision crushing me. Should I betray everything I had learned, give them the information they wanted, and save myself? Or should I risk it all, expose the truth, and hope for the best? The clock was ticking, and I knew there was no time left. The men outside were coming for me, and I had only moments to decide. As I stared at the file in my hands, my final shot at bringing them all down, I felt the pressure building. I could hand it over, escape with my life, and let everything continue as it was. Or I could make the ultimate sacrifice, risk everything, and trust that someone, anyone, would make sure the truth got out. In the heat of the moment, I made my choice. I wasn't going to let them win. Not like this. I opened the window and jumped. The fall was dizzying, and for a moment, I thought I wouldn't make it. But I didn't have time to think about that. I had to keep moving. I had to keep running. They were closing in, but I was determined to finish what I had started. The ground hit me harder than I anticipated, but my body didn't have time to process the pain. I was on the move again, running faster than I ever had in my life. My breath came in ragged gasps as I darted through narrow alleyways, doing everything I could to put distance between myself and the men who were after me. The sounds of their footsteps, their shouts, rang out in the distance, but they were getting closer. Every shadow felt like it was hiding a threat. Every corner could bring me face to face with the danger I had tried so desperately to escape. I didn't know how long I could keep running. I didn't know how far I could get, but I couldn't stop. Not now. Not after everything I had uncovered, everything I had sacrificed. They thought they could control me, that they could break me, but they hadn't counted on my will to survive. I wasn't going down without a fight. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about saving myself. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. My legs burned. My lungs screamed for air, but the adrenaline pushed me forward. I stumbled into a dimly lit street, the shadows seeming to swallow me whole. For a moment, everything was still. The sounds of the pursuit faded, and I thought maybe, just maybe, I had lost them. But I couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. That's when I saw it. A small, unmarked door tucked away in the corner of the street. It wasn't much, but something about it felt right. I hesitated for only a second before I pushed it open, slipping inside. The space was quiet, almost too quiet, and I felt a flicker of doubt. But then a voice broke the silence. "You're safe here. For now." I turned, my heart pounding, but the figure in front of me was not someone I had expected. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep the fear from creeping into my voice. "I've been watching you," the stranger replied, stepping out of the shadows. "You've been digging into things you shouldn't, but I've been watching. And now, it's time for you to stop running." I didn't trust them. Not yet. But the stranger's calm demeanor told me one thing. They weren't with the network. They weren't with the people who had been hunting me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to relax, just a little. Maybe, just maybe, I had found someone who could help me. The stranger led me into a hidden room, away from the prying eyes of the world. It was a small, unassuming place, but it felt like a sanctuary. I wasn't sure what their motives were, or why they had chosen to help me, but I was running out of options. "You've made a lot of enemies," the stranger said, their voice low but firm, "and you're not going to be able to take them down alone." I nodded, feeling the weight of the words. I had already lost so much. My husband, my trust, my peace. But if there was a chance to fix this, to expose the network and destroy everything they had built, I had to take it. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The stranger didn't hesitate. "I need your knowledge. Everything you've uncovered. You have pieces of the puzzle. We have the resources to finish it." My mind raced. This was my chance. The chance to finally take down the people who had turned my life into a nightmare. But there was a catch. The more I worked with the stranger, the more I realized that I was walking a fine line. Who were they really? What was their true goal? "We do this together," they said, as if reading my thoughts. "We expose them all. We end this. But you need to trust me." I didn't have the luxury of time. The network was still out there, still looking for me. And yet, I felt that flicker of hope inside me again. The smallest spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, I could survive this after all. Every day felt like a race against time. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered about the criminal network, about the empire my husband had been a part of. But every discovery came with a price. The more I knew, the more dangerous it became. The stranger had given me resources, a way to connect with people who could help, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching. The tension was suffocating. The network's grip was tightening. I was no longer just a woman trying to expose the truth. I was a target. I knew they were getting closer. Every move I made seemed to echo louder, drawing them in. I could feel their presence in every shadow, every corner I turned. They knew I was still out there. They knew I was still trying to bring them down. And the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. They weren't just after me anymore. They were after everything I knew, everything I had uncovered. The walls were closing in, and I had to act fast. But how could I expose them when I was the one being hunted? I had come too far to back down now. I knew the risk. I knew the danger. But the thought of everything they had done, of all the lives they had destroyed, it fueled me. I had to finish what I had started. The stranger's plan was risky, but it was my only shot at taking down the network. I had to get the final piece of the puzzle, the information that would expose them all. The network was vast, their reach endless. But it wasn't invincible. Every empire has a weak spot, and I was about to find it. The closer I got, the more I realized that I wasn't just fighting for my survival anymore. I was fighting for something bigger, something that could change everything. The network had to fall. I couldn't let them win. My role in this was critical. Without me, the pieces wouldn't fall into place. Without me, the truth would never come to light. But with every passing moment, I could feel the danger growing. I was running out of time, and I had no idea how much longer I could keep moving. But I couldn't stop. Not now. I had trusted the stranger, believed they were my ally. But in the chaos of it all, something didn't feel right. There had been too many coincidences, too many moments where things didn't add up. And then, the unthinkable happened. The betrayal hit me like a punch to the stomach. The stranger, the person I had risked everything to work with, they weren't who they said they were. They had been working with the network all along. Everything they had told me, every plan they had shared, was a lie. It was all part of the trap. The realization washed over me like ice water. I had been used. The information I had uncovered, the steps I had taken, all of it had been manipulated to lead me into a false sense of security. I had trusted the wrong person. I had trusted someone who had been orchestrating my downfall from the very beginning. And now, with no one left to turn to, I was completely alone. The network was closer than ever, and I had no allies left. The only thing I could count on was myself, and that was quickly becoming not enough. Betrayal stung like a fresh wound, but it was far from the end. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of it all. The stranger, now revealed to be a traitor, had set me up perfectly. Every move I made, every piece of information I uncovered, had played into their hands. But I refused to give up. The truth was still in my possession, buried deep within my mind and in the files I had secured. No matter how hard they tried to break me, they could not take that from me. I was alone, but I wasn't helpless. The network was vast, its reach seemingly unstoppable, but it was not invincible. And the only way I could bring it down now was to outsmart them, use their own tactics against them. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. I had to rely on my instincts, my wit, and the one thing they hadn't anticipated, my will to survive. The truth was still in my hands, and I would make sure they never got their hands on it. As I kept moving, never staying in one place for too long, I realized I needed help, but I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Not the authorities, not the strangers, not even the people who had offered their assistance before. There was only one way out. Find someone who could help me, but someone who wouldn't betray me. My options were limited, and the situation was growing more dire with each passing hour. And then, out of nowhere, I received a message. It was coded, but I could understand it. Someone had been tracking me, and they knew how to take down the network. They had access to the resources I needed, the ones that could help me finish what I started. But there was a catch. They wanted something in return, something I wasn't sure I could give. In exchange for their help, I had to make a deal with them. I had no choice. If I wanted to win, if I wanted to survive, I had to make this deal, no matter the cost. But I didn't know what price I would have to pay. And that uncertainty gnawed at me. What was I willing to sacrifice to bring this network down? What was the cost of my redemption? The deal had been made. The plan was set into motion, and I knew there was no turning back. The resources I needed were in place. The information was ready to be exposed. This was the moment that would either bring the network crashing down or destroy me in the process. My pulse quickened as I prepared for the final step. The plan wasn't perfect. It never was. But it was the best I had. The clock was ticking, and I had no time to second-guess myself. The final move was in motion. The pieces were falling into place. But I couldn't shake the fear that gripped me. What if it all fell apart? What if everything I had fought for was in vain? The danger was closer now than ever before. The network was watching, waiting, preparing to strike. They were closing in on me, and I could feel their eyes on my every move. But there was no going back. This was my last shot. I had to see it through, no matter the cost. The stakes were higher than ever before, and all I could do now was wait for the storm to break. The plan was in motion, but nothing ever goes as planned. I had learned that the hard way. Every twist, every turn, every unexpected move from the network seemed to push me further into a corner. The resources were in place, the final pieces of the puzzle ready to be exposed, but something didn't feel right. I could feel the weight of every decision on my shoulders. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything I had worked for, everything I had risked, would be lost. The network was ruthless, and they weren't going to let me get away with this. I knew they were watching. They had eyes everywhere, and I was just a pawn in their game. But I wasn't going to give up now. I couldn't. Not after everything I had uncovered. Not after everything I had fought for. I had to keep moving, stay one step ahead. But the closer I got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. The storm was coming, and I was right in the middle of it. Just when I thought I had everything under control, the unexpected happened. The network made a bold move, one I wasn't prepared for. They had figured out my plan. They knew exactly what I was doing and where I was going. The feeling of being watched, of being hunted, became all too real. It was no longer a matter of gathering information. It was a fight for survival. They were closing in, and I could feel their presence everywhere. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face, made my heart race. I had been careful, calculated, but this was a move I hadn't anticipated. It shook me to my core. The network had pulled the strings from behind the scenes, setting me up for a fall. They had turned the tables, and I was trapped. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The walls were closing in, and I could feel the weight of it all. This was it. This was the moment where everything I had worked for would either be realized or destroyed. The stakes had never been higher. I had no choice but to make my final move. The plan was in place, the truth in my hands. It was time to expose everything, to bring down the network once and for all. But as I prepared to push the button that would end it all, I made a discovery that changed everything. A file, buried deep within the evidence I had gathered, held a piece of information I had missed, a crucial detail that altered the entire narrative I had been fighting for. The truth I thought I knew was not the truth at all. The network wasn't just some criminal organization. It was much bigger, much more complex than I had ever imagined. The people I had trusted, the allies I thought I had, were part of something far more dangerous. The betrayal was deeper than I had ever realized. I was no longer just fighting to expose the network. I was fighting for my own survival. The truth had just become more dangerous than I ever thought possible. And now, I had to figure out what to do with it. The truth was like a knife, cutting deep into the fabric of everything I had believed in. I had uncovered a connection so shocking, so far-reaching, that it shook me to my very core. The network wasn't just a criminal enterprise. It was a well-oiled machine, built on the backs of people I had trusted, the allies I had relied on, the stranger who had helped me. All of them were tied to it in ways I couldn't even begin to comprehend. I had been living in a house of mirrors, every reflection a lie. But now the pieces were falling into place. The truth was finally within my grasp, but the closer I got, the more dangerous it became. I had to decide who I could trust. My choices were limited, and the danger was closing in. Everyone had their own agendas, their own reasons for helping or betraying me. The question was no longer just about exposing the network. It was about surviving long enough to expose it. And in that moment, I realized something. The truth didn't set you free. It made you a target. The fear was overwhelming. The pressure was suffocating. But I couldn't back down now. Not after everything I had uncovered. The network was bigger, more dangerous, and more connected than I had ever imagined. And someone close to me, someone I had trusted with my life, had been lying all along. The shock of it hit me like a cold wave. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed the signs? The betrayal ran deeper than I had ever imagined. The person I had relied on, the one I thought had my back, had been working with the enemy the entire time. The truth was like a jigsaw puzzle, and now the last piece had fallen into place. I was no longer just trying to bring down a criminal network. I was fighting for my very life. The stakes had never been higher, and now I had to confront the person who had deceived me. But how could I trust anything or anyone anymore? The lies had become too tangled, too deeply ingrained in every aspect of my life. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for survival. The rules of the game had changed. Everything I thought I knew, every plan I had made, was no longer valid. The betrayal had run deeper than I ever could have imagined, and the people I had trusted, my supposed allies, had been working against me from the start. The shock was nearly enough to break me, but I couldn't afford to fall apart. The truth was still within reach, but I had to be smarter now. I had to outwit the very people who had helped me, the very people who had been feeding me lies. I wasn't just fighting the network anymore. I was fighting those who had been pretending to be on my side. Every move I made had to be calculated. One wrong step, one careless mistake, and I would be walking straight into a trap. The web of lies was more intricate than I had ever realized, and every thread I pulled seemed to lead me deeper into the maze. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far. The final confrontation was near, and I had to make sure I was ready for whatever came next. No more second chances. This was the endgame. The moment I had been dreading had arrived. The final confrontation was inevitable, and there was no turning back now. I had everything I needed to bring down the network, the truth in my hands. But the cost of getting to this point had been steep. Trust had been shattered, relationships destroyed, and the line between ally and enemy had blurred beyond recognition. Every step forward had led me deeper into the heart of the chaos. And now, with everything on the line, I had to face the consequences of my choices. The network was waiting. They knew I was coming, and they were prepared to do whatever it took to stop me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been replaced by determination. The pieces of the puzzle had finally come together, and I knew exactly what needed to be done. This was the endgame. This was where it all came to a head. And as I prepared to make my final move, I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. The cost had been steep, but I had no choice but to finish what I had started. They thought they had won. They thought they had outsmarted me at every turn, but they had underestimated me. I had spent so much time being manipulated, lied to, betrayed, but I had learned. I had learned how to play the game. The final pieces of the network's empire were in my hands, and I was about to bring everything crashing down. They had relied on their power, their resources, their manipulation to control me. But they didn't realize that I had one final trick up my sleeve. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way to expose everything. The network thought they could crush me, silence me, but they didn't know what I was capable of. I had been planning this moment for too long, and now it was time to strike. With one final move, I would take down everything they had built, everything they had fought to protect. And when the dust settled, I would be the one standing. The network's empire would crumble, and I would be the one to bring them down. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about justice. And justice was coming. The silence was deafening. The network had fallen, their empire crumbling in the wake of everything I had exposed. The truth had been revealed, and the world would know what they had done, who they had been. But as I stood there, watching it all unfold, I couldn't shake the feeling of loss. Yes, I had won. Yes, I had brought them down. But the cost had been more than I could have ever imagined. The betrayals, the lies, the people I had trusted, none of it would ever be the same. The truth had come at a price, and I was left to pick up the pieces. The weight of everything I had lost hung heavy on my heart. I had sacrificed so much to expose the truth, but now I was alone. The people I had fought for, those who had been caught in the web of the network, were free. But the scars of this battle would never fade. The truth had been exposed, but the journey had left me broken. I had won, but in the end, I had lost too.